What is the secret to Joe Rogan's success? I'm going to talk about that right after this. Hey everyone, I'm Yoel and welcome back to my YouTube channel. So grateful to have you. And in today's video, I'm going to discuss what I feel are the secrets to Joe Rogan's success. Okay, Joe Rogan has probably the most popular podcast out there, the Joe Rogan Experience. I would say he's the gold standard. Anybody who's in the podcasting or YouTube channel space is striving to be as popular and successful as Joe Rogan. I don't think anybody will actually quite get there. Well, I shouldn't say anybody, but I think it would be very difficult. Just like I wouldn't say nobody could ever be the president of the United States. The reality is that most people who aim to be the president of the United States don't become one. It's kind of funny. I'm comparing Joe Rogan to the president of the United States, but I guess you can say in the podcast or video space, that's kind of the comparison of the president. He's really the president of this space. That's how enormously popular he is. And I found myself wondering to myself, like, what is it about Rogan that makes him and his channel so popular? And obviously you can be cynical about it. You can say, well, look, he started as a celebrity. He was on Fear Factor. He was the host of Fear Factor. He's a comedian, obviously an enormously talented individual. But I think to build and for the channel to grow, his podcast to grow in the way in which it did, and to maintain its stronghold in the space, I don't think that's by accident. I don't think it would be fair to take away credit from him. I think a lot of that has to do with him, as I'm going to share in this video. Okay, so jumping right in, the number one, this isn't necessarily in order of priority, but just as I jotted down my points, the number one thing that I think about when I think about what makes Joe Rogan's podcast so popular is that he asks questions. I alluded to this in an earlier video when I was talking about truth. And one of the ways of getting towards truth and what it means, what truth means, is the subject of this other video. Maybe I'll link it above if I can figure out how to do that. But one of the keys to truth, or at least discovery of truth and striving for truth, is to ask questions. Okay, having that curiosity. I would kind of tie in the idea of curiosity. Joe Rogan, I find, is a very curious person. Okay, so having that curiosity and then asking questions to get responses to feed that curiosity and try and understand an issue. Okay, so if you've watched Joe Rogan's, if you watch them on YouTube or you listen to his podcast, you'll see he asks a lot of questions and he does it very simply. He doesn't get too deep into the issues, at least to start with. As the discussions carry on, oftentimes it does get into the esoteric and it does get into some of the, more detailed analysis, but at least to start with, just to warm things up anyways, he just starts by asking questions. Okay, he's not out there to start, just talking your ear off or anything like that when he has a guest on. He wants to hear what the guest has to say, and he does that by asking questions. Okay, and it's not a surprise, for example, that there are many teachers who, they subscribe to the Socratic method of teaching, which means that they ask questions to get responses from their students, because a great way of learning is to ask those questions. And I think Rogan does that beautifully. He asks very easy questions. He gets the guests talking. He gets answers to the questions. By doing that, he educates and informs himself. And that way he's able to have a much more meaningful discussion versus if he was just to sort of jab, if him and his guests were just jabbing at one another. Okay, there obviously are popular podcasts or YouTube channels where the guests do that. I could think of, I was thinking of Smartless, which is obviously a very popular podcast as well. They definitely ask questions, but a lot of it is spent joking around. It's obviously a very different style than Rogan's podcast. It's more meant to be humorous and it's more in the entertainment space. And I'm not knocking it, but in terms of getting informed, which I think is what a lot of the viewership of Rogan's podcast is there for, Rogan does it masterfully by asking questions. Okay. Now, number two on my list of what makes Rogan so popular is kind of related. It's the corollary of the asking questions, which is that he actually listens to the answers. Okay, if you watch Rogan's videos, you'll see it's very rare that he'll cut off one of his guests. Okay, and if he does so, it's more to sort of supplement what the guest is saying, as opposed to trying to cross-examine him or try and get his own point across before the guest has had a chance to give his or her opinion or express an idea. Okay, I find that Rogan is an excellent listener. And by listening, by the way, that's also a great way of asking great questions, because if you're asking questions and your entire mindset is the next question you're going to ask, and you're not paying attention to the responses, your questions are not going to be as valuable, and therefore the learning that comes from those questions are not going to be as productive. Okay, so what Rogan does is he listens, he gives the guests as much time as they need to answer the questions, and that just makes for a much more informed discussion. And one of the ways in which Rogan can do that, by the way, if you've noticed, is that there isn't at least as of the date of this recording, there's no time limit on his show. So his show will run for a very long time, more than I would say the average podcast goes for. But I think it's not an accident that he does that, because that allows his guests to say what they're going to say, and it allows for a more meaningful discussion. If you find that, on your channel, or, in what you're trying to accomplish, if you're somebody who's trying to, strive to be like Rogan's channel or podcast, and you find that, well, I don't have 3 hours to spend, then that's fine. Nobody's saying that you have to spend that amount of time. But I do think with the time that you're given, if you are the type of show that has guests on it, if you can allow the person you're speaking to respond fully, you're going to have a much more quality discussion than if you're constantly cutting that person off. And obviously, the point of this video is not just for people who are podcasting or making videos. These are lessons for life as well. Okay, if you're the type of person who has a relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship or with friends, your relationship is going to be that much stronger if you're able to really genuinely have a curiosity and ask questions about somebody, and also have a chance to listen to their responses. Okay, so those are two things that come to me right off the bat. One is asking questions, and two, the corollary to that almost is allowing the guests to answer the questions so that Rogan could actually learn from what they're saying and make the discussion that much more meaningful. Now, the third thing I jotted down here is that I find that Rogan is very receptive to people's ideas and opinions. Okay, he has guests from all walks of life, whether it's, Ben Shapiro's been a guest on his show. He's had people that are on the far left, so to speak, that are on his show, all sorts of guests with different viewpoints and opinions. And Rogan is willing to listen to them, and he's willing to hear them out. And I think that makes for a much more balanced and nuanced show. Okay, because yes, there are definitely I mentioned Ben Shapiro. Definitely his viewership is going to be, and this isn't knocking Ben Shapiro, he's obviously enormously successful, but his viewership is obviously going to be mostly right-wingers who agree with his viewpoints, or people who are just trying to bash him. But whatever the case may be, I think in Rogan's case, it's a very enriching experience, because he's got people from all walks of life, from all the spectrums, and he's very receptive to what they have to say. That doesn't mean he necessarily has to agree with them, but he's willing, he's not closed-minded, he's receptive enough to have them come on his show and state their opinions, even if it's something that he may in his personal life not agree with. Okay, so I think that makes for a very enriching podcast. Now, again, if you're in the podcast, or you have a channel, a YouTube channel, and you're in that space, and you want to be more of a political commentator, or you do want to take stances, that's your right, that's your choice. But if you're asking me what makes Rogan such a popular podcast, I think the fact is that he's willing to take guests from all sorts of walks of life and listen to what they have to say and be receptive. That makes for a much more meaningful discussion for somebody to tune into. Okay, now the fourth thing I jotted down here, it's kind of related, is that he's not rigid. Okay, so if you see, a lot of times Rogan, he may bring to an interview or to a guest that he has a certain opinion, and he'll ask a question that shows what his opinion may be in that matter. And then when he hears what the guest has to say, a lot of times Rogan will be like, I didn't think of that, or I didn't look at it from that perspective. And I just think that that's a wonderful quality to have, because, rather than being stuck and entrenched in his views, he's willing to see what the other guest is going to say and roll with it. So it's kind of related. Also, related to the last point, I should say, regarding being receptive, but also he's not rigid in the sense that, he doesn't have this agenda of where you have to stick to the game plan, so to speak, of where he wants the show to go. He always says this, and I love quoting him on this. He always says, "There's no structure here." Okay, I love that. I hosted another podcast with somebody, and one of the things that was frustrating for me, and I'm not saying this behind his back, I would tell him this, is that I felt that a lot of times I wanted to sort of freestyle in how we're going to do the podcast. We don't always have to interview guests. Maybe we want to do discussions amongst ourselves. Maybe we want to have different types of guests. And I felt that in my experience, the person I was podcasting with, he was not as receptive to that. Now he had his own reasons, and it's not an attack on him. He has genuinely has the right to have that opinion, and he had reasons for why he wanted to do that. But for me personally, I find that it's a much more rewarding and enriching experience if you're not rigid and sticking to a game plan, if you can kind of roll with it. So when Rogan says there's no structure here, it sounds kind of flippant and funny, which it is. But I think that's one of the key secrets to his success, because he's able to roll with the punches and to take things in whatever direction the discussion may take him to. And that can get you to all sorts of new territories that you may not have thought you would get to when you started with that guest. Okay, so that's not being rigid, I think, is another secret to Rogan's success. And finally, the last point that I jotted down here is that Rogan discusses what interests him. Now, this may sound obvious, like, well, of course, what else is he going to talk about? But you know what? That's not always the case. A lot of times, again, if you're in the podcast space or you have a YouTube channel, you're going to want to, you may be trying to go out there and get the views or get the clicks and not really discuss things that interest you per se. And that that energy that you bring to that show or that episode, it may not be, at the peak condition where you want it to be, and that will be reflected in how your viewers watch you. Okay, if you don't have that energy, your viewers will know it. If you're not into something, they will know it. Whereas with Rogan, I think that everything that I'm sure if you asked him, he wouldn't say every single episode is his favorite episode, but I'll bet you that he chooses to discuss things that interest him. And I can tell you that personally, I've followed that model. I was toying with the idea of certain types of videos I want to do. And then I had to ask myself, well, what's my motivation behind this? Is it because it's something that interests me, or is it something that I feel is just going to get a lot of views? And if I do it simply because I feel it's going to get a lot of views, then I err on the side of not doing that video. Of course, if it's something I have an interest in, I have a passion for, and I feel like it's something that could get views, then great. That's a wonderful mix. But to do something just because you feel like it's something that's going to get you views is not going to translate well into being a popular channel or podcast. And I think with Rogan, it's I guess what I'm getting at is that it's very authentic. Okay. He's very authentic in what he's doing. The guests he brings on, he's genuinely interested in what he's talking about. And that enthusiasm shows. And when you have that enthusiasm in what you're doing, that becomes infectious. And the people watching or listening to you are also going to share that enthusiasm. And for the ones who aren't interested in that particular episode, the beauty again about Rogan's podcast and not being too rigid and all the different types of guests he has is that there's something for everybody. I haven't made a separate header for that as one of his secrets, but I think that's important as well. And Rogan's, anybody, I've met people from all sorts of walks of life who are big Rogan fans, and really the two different people, I could have two people in this room telling me they love Rogan. One will say one reason why he loves Rogan. The other one will say the reason that he loves Rogan, and it'll be for two completely different reasons coming from two different sides of the spectrum. But that's the beauty. There's something for everybody on Rogan's show. And that speaks to a lot about his, not being rigid, being flexible and loose and not sticking to one particular structure. So that wraps up my list. I mean, there's so many accolades, I could give to Rogan for the work that he does. I'm sure I could come up with many more points, but these are the ones that kind of stuck out. And just to do a little summary, number one, in terms of the secrets to Rogan's success, the number one factor I said when I started this video is that he asks questions. Number two is that he's a great listener. He allows guests to actually share their answers. He doesn't cut them off. Number three is that he is receptive to different opinions. Okay, so whether or not he agrees with what the guest has to say, he's definitely receptive to what they're saying. And oftentimes you will find that he is changing his viewpoint, or at least acknowledging on the air that his perspective may have changed after he heard what the guest has to say. Number four is that he's not rigid. He allows the podcast a very structureless, informal type of setting. And because of that, he allows the discussion to go where it's leading rather than cutting off the guests and trying to, tick off points that he wants to tick off. And number five, in terms of the secrets to Rogan's success, is that he discusses things that interest him. Okay, things you can say that he's passionate about. And by doing that, the energy that he brings gets reflected, bounces off that YouTube screen, if you will, into the people watching, or onto those radio waves or podcast radio, dating myself, but into the podcast waves and signals, and anybody who's listening really feeds off that energy. So I hope you found that video educational, interesting. There are some takeaways, I would say. Again, it's not just for people in the YouTube or podcasting space. The idea of when when you're having a discussion with somebody, the idea of trying to learn from somebody, to ask questions, to have that curiosity, and also to answer, to have, allow somebody to answer, see, hear what he or she has to say. Not being too rigid is a lesson you can apply in life, obviously. Trying to be loose and let go. You may have a certain perception of how things have to be or how things are, but you can let go of that. And obviously doing something that you're interested in and that you're passionate about, rather than just kind of doing what others expect of you. These are all lessons that you can apply to your life as well. Maybe I'll do future videos on all these points, but for now, the points I listed here are what I think are the secrets to Joe Rogan's success. If you think that there are other things that contribute to Rogan's success, or if you disagree with me, I'm always open to feedback. Leave a comment in the space below, and who knows, maybe I'll talk about that in a future video. So I will see you in the next video, and thanks again for joining. Hey guys, this is your annoying reminder to please hit that subscribe button. You'll be helping me out, and you'll also get notified of the next cool video. And check out the other videos on my channel. There's some great stuff over there, all sorts of topics. Take care.